The morning light crept slowly into the courthouse, its golden rays spilling through tall, dusty windows that had witnessed decades of trials, confessions, verdicts, and stories that would never be told outside these walls. The building itself carried an air of solemn history, its heavy oak doors groaning with every push, as if reluctant to let in the chaos of the outside world. Within those walls, silence was never truly silence. It was filled with the faint hum of overhead lights, the distant murmur of voices from other courtrooms, and the occasional metallic clink of a gavel being set down on its block. This was not an ordinary day for those gathered inside. From the moment the first people arrived, a certain tension had hung in the air, invisible but palpable, as though everyone knew they were on the edge of something significant, though they couldn't quite name it. The case at hand was not one of high-profile criminal drama, nor was it a matter that would attract national media attention, at least not yet. But for those who would witness it, this day would etch itself into memory in a way that was impossible to forget. The benches in the public seating area had filled quickly. Families, friends, and strangers sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes flicking occasionally toward the polished wooden rail that separated them from the proceedings. There was a certain buzz among them, an undercurrent of curiosity and apprehension. Court days often held drama, but this felt different. Near the front of the courtroom sat a little black girl, no older than 10 or 11, her small frame swallowed up by the hard wooden bench. She was dressed neatly, her hair pulled back with care, and her hands folded tightly in her lap as though holding on to her own courage. Though her feet barely brushed the floor, there was something unshakable in her posture. She sat beside an older woman, likely her mother, who kept one hand resting lightly on her daughter's arm, a quiet gesture of reassurance. The case being heard had its roots in a street encounter several weeks prior, an interaction between this girl's family and a local police officer that had spiraled into something no one had expected. It had begun, as many such incidents do, with something small, a stop in a neighborhood, a few questions asked, a certain tone of voice. And then the weight of history, bias, and misunderstanding piling on top, until the moment became more than just a misunderstanding. It became a statement about how people were seen, heard, and treated. The officer in question was seated at the defense table, his uniform replaced by a pressed suit that still somehow carried the authority of his badge. He sat with an air of practiced composure, his eyes fixed forward, though there was a tightness in his jaw that betrayed the strain beneath. The judge presiding over the matter was a figure of calm authority, her robe falling in clean lines, her hands folded before her as she listened to each side present their account. She had seen her share of disputes, of difficult moments where truth and perception danced around each other, never quite aligning, but even she could sense that this day carried a different weight. The proceedings moved steadily, evidence and testimonies flowing like a river that seemed calm on the surface but churned dangerously below. Witnesses spoke, attorneys made their points, and the facts were laid bare in meticulous order. Yet, through it all, the little girl sat quietly, watching, listening, absorbing every word. No one expected her to speak. She was not on the witness list, nor had her presence been more than a quiet note in the background. But as the moments passed, her stillness seemed to grow heavier, like a gathering storm. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly when the judge asked if there was anything further before she moved to her closing remarks. That was when the little girl rose from her seat. It was not the dramatic movement of someone seeking attention. It was slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, but her steps toward the front of the room drew every eye. The shuffle of feet and the rustle of papers fell away into silence. Her mother's gaze followed her, a mix of pride and worry etched into her face. She stood there, small against the imposing backdrop of the courtroom, looking up at the judge and then turning toward the officer. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering. What she said in that moment was not the rehearsed testimony of someone coached for the stand, nor the carefully worded statement of a prepared speech. It was raw, honest, from the heart. She spoke about what she saw that day, about what it felt like to be on the receiving end of suspicion when all she had done was exist. She spoke of fear hers and her family's, but also of the questions she carried. Why someone sworn to protect could look at her and see something else entirely. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every ear strained to catch her words. Every heart leaned forward. Even the officer's composure shifted. The tight line of his mouth loosened slightly, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in something far more complicated. Her words were not an attack, but they cut through the air sharper than any accusation. They carried the weight of truth, spoken simply, without embellishment, and when she finished, she did not cry or turn away. She simply stood there, waiting. The judge, for a long moment, said nothing. The attorneys remained still, sensing that something far beyond legal argument had just occurred, and all eyes turned toward the officer. It was then that the unexpected happened, something no one in the room could have predicted. The officer shifted in his seat, his hand moving slowly to rest on the table before him. He stood, his gaze steady, and began to speak. His words did not come with the defensive sharpness many anticipated. They were quiet at first, then grew with a strange sincerity that felt almost out of place in a courtroom. He spoke not as an officer defending his actions, but as a man confronting something within himself. What he said in that moment would ripple far beyond the walls of that courtroom, carrying with it a kind of vulnerability and honesty rarely seen in such a setting. It was the kind of reply that could change how people remembered you, not for the uniform you wore, but for the humanity you allowed yourself to reveal. And as he spoke, the faces in the room shifted from guarded judgment to a collective, stunned silence. Something was unfolding here, something that could not be contained by legal procedure alone. The air felt charged, as though everyone present knew they were witnessing a moment that would leave an imprint on them. It was not about winning or losing anymore. It was about understanding, acknowledgement, and the possibility, however faint, of change. When the officer's voice finally faded, the room remained still. No one moved, no one spoke. The moment lingered, fragile and powerful, like a candle flame in a darkened room. And in the quiet that followed, it was clear that the story of this day was only beginning to be written. The judge looked between them, the small girl and the man in uniform, and knew that the next chapter of this case would not be dictated solely by the law, but by the unspoken truths that had just surfaced. The gavel had not yet fallen, but the weight of the moment had already shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. Somewhere deep in the hallways of the courthouse, another door closed with a heavy echo, as though marking the end of one moment and the beginning of another. What would follow was uncertain, but no one in that room would leave unchanged. And as the little girl returned to her seat, her mother's hand finding hers again, there was a quiet resolve in her eyes. She had spoken her truth. Now the world, or at least this small corner of it, would have to decide what to do with it. The officer remained standing for a moment longer, as though trying to anchor himself in the weight of what had just been said. His reply had stunned the room, but its true consequences had yet to unfold. Outside, the midday sun shone brightly against the courthouse steps, casting long shadows that hinted at the work still ahead. Inside, the air was still thick with the echo of words that could not be unsaid, and somewhere in the space between them, between the girl and the officer, between what was spoken and what was felt, something had shifted, setting the stage for what was yet to come. The story was far from over, and when the next day came, the weight of that moment would follow them all back into this room. The night after the courtroom exchange, the city seemed quieter than usual. It was as though the streets themselves were holding their breath, mirroring the pause that lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed what happened earlier that day. For many, sleep did not come easily. The image of the little girl standing before the court, speaking words far older than her years, replayed again and again in the minds of the people who had sat in that room. And alongside it, the officer's unexpected reply, his voice stripped of the armor of authority, echoed with surprising weight. By the time morning arrived, the courthouse was once again the center of attention. News of the exchange had begun to ripple outward, carried not by television cameras, but by whispers, text messages, and hurried phone calls. People told the story with awe, each retelling slightly different, yet all carrying the same core: a child's courage, an officer's humility, and a room left in stunned silence. The second day of proceedings dawned under a gray sky, the clouds hanging low, as though the world itself was preparing for something heavy. The courthouse steps were busier than usual. Onlookers had arrived early, some who had been there the day before hoping to witness the rest of the story unfold, others drawn purely by curiosity after hearing about the previous day's events. The corridors inside were alive with murmurs, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional low laugh from those who seemed unaware of the gravity of the case. The girl arrived with her mother, her hand clasped tightly in her mother's as they navigated the narrow hallway toward the same bench they had occupied the day before. The moment she entered the courtroom, eyes turned toward her, not in judgment, but in something closer to admiration. People recognized her now, not as a name on a docket or the daughter of someone involved in a case, but as the girl who had spoken, the girl who had made an entire room listen. The officer entered shortly after. His walk was measured, his eyes avoiding unnecessary contact with the crowd. He looked different somehow, not in appearance, but in presence. It was as if the previous day had stripped away something invisible, leaving behind a man more exposed than he had ever intended to be. The weight of the room's attention was not lost on him, yet he did not shy away from it entirely. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet resolve of someone who understood that the day ahead might demand even more of him than the last. When court was called into session, there was a noticeable shift in the air. The formalities felt sharper, the words exchanged between judge and attorneys more deliberate. Everyone knew that yesterday's moment had altered the tone of these proceedings, and though no one would say it aloud, the law was no longer the only thing being weighed. Testimonies resumed, but the tension was no longer just between two sides of a legal argument. It was layered now, carrying questions about truth, reconciliation, and whether a single moment of honesty could change the course of a long-standing wound. Witnesses recounted events from different angles, their versions of the truth brushing up against one another, sometimes aligning, sometimes contradicting. Through it all, The little girl listened again, her gaze steady, her hands still folded in her lap. There were moments when the officer's eyes drifted toward her, not for long, not in a way that could be misread, but enough to acknowledge her presence. The unspoken connection between them, forged in the quiet aftermath of her words and his response, was still there. It hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Outside the courthouse, the story was spreading faster. By mid-morning, small groups of people had gathered, some holding signs that spoke of justice and accountability, others carrying messages of unity and understanding. It was not the chaotic protest that often made headlines. It was quieter, more deliberate. The people there were not shouting, but they were present, their presence alone speaking volumes. Inside, the proceedings began to probe deeper into the heart of the matter. The defense sought to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, a moment where perception and reality diverged under tense circumstances. The prosecution painted a different picture, one of patterns and history, of how such misunderstandings too often fell along the same lines of race and identity. Each argument was met with counter-arguments, each piece of evidence examined and re-examined. But beneath all of it was the shadow of yesterday's exchange. It had become the silent backdrop against which everything else was judged. People found themselves listening differently, weighing each word with the memory of the girl's voice and the officer's reply in mind. At one point, during a brief recess, the girl and her mother stepped out into the hallway. The air there was cooler, the sound of footsteps echoing off the marble floor. A few people approached them quietly, offering nods of respect or murmured words of encouragement. The girl accepted it all with a calm that seemed beyond her years, but her mother's eyes betrayed the weight of it. She knew her daughter's courage had set something in motion, something neither of them could fully control now. Back inside, the judge's demeanor remained steady, but her eyes occasionally softened when they flickered toward the girl. Judges were trained to keep personal feelings from influencing their rulings, but even she could not deny that what had happened yesterday had touched something deeper than her judicial responsibilities. The afternoon wore on, and the courtroom began to feel heavier. The legal arguments were reaching their final stages, the evidence nearly exhausted. Yet there was a sense that one more moment, something unplanned, something human, was still waiting to happen. The kind of moment that could seal the story, not just in the record, but in memory. That moment came unexpectedly. The defense called the officer back to the stand, intending to clarify certain points from his earlier testimony. But as he sat there again, facing questions that felt almost mechanical, his eyes strayed once more toward the little girl. Something in his expression shifted. Perhaps it was the weight of the crowd's gaze, or the knowledge that the story outside these walls was already taking on a life of its own. Or perhaps it was the simple truth that yesterday's exchange had cracked something open inside him, and it could not be closed again. His answers began to drift from the strict confines of legal defense. He spoke in broader terms now about his role as an officer, about what it meant to serve a community where trust was fragile and easily broken. He acknowledged things not often said aloud in such settings, that mistakes could be made not out of malice, but out of assumptions, and that such assumptions carried consequences no badge could erase. The courtroom was still as his words settled over them. This was not part of the defense strategy, nor the kind of statement one made to secure a favorable ruling. This was something else, a man grappling openly with the space between his intention and the impact of his actions. When he finished, there was no applause, no outburst, just the quiet understanding that something rare had just taken place. The judge, after a long pause, announced that proceedings would resume the next morning for final statements and her decision. As people began to file out, the little girl remained seated for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the spot where the officer had been. She seemed to understand, in a way few others could, that what had been said today would follow both of them long after this case was over. Outside, the air had grown colder, the clouds heavier, the courthouse steps were crowded again, reporters now mingling with the small groups of citizens who had gathered earlier. The story was no longer contained to the people in the room. It was spreading, reshaping itself in the telling, but always returning to the same central moment. The girl and her mother left quietly, their steps steady, the noise of the crowd fading behind them. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour, its sound deep and resonant, marking the close of another day in a story that was not yet finished. And, as night began to fall, the city seemed once again to settle into a kind of watchful stillness, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The third morning arrived with a light rain falling over the city, coating the courthouse steps in a reflective sheen. The gray sky above seemed to press down on the buildings, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. It was decision day, and although the case itself was rooted in one specific incident, it now carried far more than the facts of that day. It carried the echoes of the little girl's voice, the vulnerability in the officer's reply, and the quiet reckoning that had settled over everyone who had been part of the proceedings. People arrived earlier than before. By the time the heavy oak doors swung open, the hallway was already lined with faces, some familiar from previous days, others new. They came not only to hear a verdict, but to witness the resolution of something that had transcended the boundaries of a single legal matter. The buzz of low conversation filled the air, punctuated by the soft thud of wet shoes against the polished floor. The little girl and her mother arrived quietly, as they had each day, their steps measured, their faces composed. They took their seats in the same bench, the girl's eyes scanning the room briefly before settling forward. She wore the same calm expression she had carried from the beginning, but in her stillness there was also a readiness, as if she understood that this day would be the final page of a chapter she had helped write. The officer entered not long after. His movements were deliberate, his gaze forward, but there was no mistaking the shift in his demeanor since the first day. The armor of defensiveness had given way to something more open, though still guarded by the reality of the position he held. He took his seat at the defense table, glancing briefly toward the judge's bench before resting his hands on the table in front of him. When the bailiff called the court to order, the room fell into silence, the only sound the soft patter of rain against the tall windows. The judge looked out over the assembled faces, her expression as even as ever, but her voice carried a certain gravity that matched the day. Before the decision could be read, both sides were given the chance to make final statements. The prosecution spoke first, outlining once more the sequence of events, the implications of the officer's actions, and the importance of accountability. Their tone was firm but not vengeful, placing emphasis on the broader significance of what had happened, not just to one family, but to the trust between law enforcement and the community it served. The defense followed, summarizing their position while acknowledging that the officer's own words in the past 2 days had shifted the narrative. They argued for understanding, for the recognition that intent and perception were not always aligned, and that this case was as much about learning as it was about justice. Then, unexpectedly, the officer himself stood. He was not required to speak again, yet he did. His voice was steady, but it carried an honesty that drew every ear in the room. He spoke of reflection, of the days since the incident, and of the lessons he could no longer ignore. He admitted to the moments where assumption had replaced observation, and how those assumptions had colored his actions without him even realizing it. He spoke of the responsibility he bore, not just in the uniform, but in the weight of how that uniform shaped every interaction he had. It was not a plea for forgiveness, nor an attempt to sway the outcome. It was a statement, a final acknowledgement of the impact his actions had on one little girl, her family, and the room full of people who had witnessed the unfolding of their story. When he finished, the room was silent. No shifting in seats, no clearing of throats, just a collective pause, as though giving space for the words to settle. The judge began her remarks slowly, her tone deliberate. She acknowledged the complexity of the case, the fact that while the law required her to consider specific elements and standards, she could not ignore the human truths that had emerged during the proceedings. She spoke of the courage it had taken for a child to stand and speak, of the rare vulnerability shown in the officer's reply, and of the possibility that moments like this could be seeds for change if they were not left to fade. The ruling was delivered with the precision of her position, outlining the findings of the court, while the decision addressed the legal aspects, assigning responsibility, recommending measures for restitution, and mandating corrective training. It also carried an unusual final note. The judge ordered that the officer participate in a community-led forum, one that would allow for open dialogue between law enforcement and residents, with the little girl and her family invited to attend if they chose. It was a ruling that balanced accountability with an opportunity for growth, a choice that reflected not just the law, but the deeper needs revealed over the past 3 days. When the gavel finally struck, it sounded less like an ending and more like a marker, signaling the close of one chapter, but the start of something beyond the courtroom. As people began to rise from their seats, the officer looked toward the little girl once more. Their eyes met briefly, not with the tension of adversaries, but with the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had faced each other honestly and been changed by it. The girl held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod before turning back toward her mother. Outside, the rain had slowed to a fine mist, the streets glistening under the muted light. Clusters of people stood on the courthouse steps, talking in low voices, the story already beginning to take shape in their own words. Reporters gathered quotes, cameras clicked, but the heart of the moment belonged to those who had been inside the room. The girl and her mother walked down the steps slowly, the damp air cool against their skin. They did not rush, even as the crowd parted for them. The mother's hand rested gently on her daughter's shoulder, and for the first time in days, a faint smile curved the corners of her mouth. The officer exited through a side door, avoiding the press, his steps taking him toward a quieter street. He walked with his head slightly bowed, not in shame, but in thought. He knew the days ahead would not be easy, that change, both personal and institutional, was a long road, but he also knew that the first step had already been taken, and it had begun with the voice of a child. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the city. It appeared in local newspapers, then in regional broadcasts, and eventually found its way into national conversations. Some saw it as a sign of hope, others as a reminder of the work still to be done. For the little girl, it became a moment she would carry with her, not as a burden, but as a quiet proof of what could happen when truth was spoken without fear. And for the officer, it was a turning point. His reply that day in court had not been calculated, it had been real, and it was that reality, raw and unshielded, that had stunned the room and changed the way people saw him. The rain cleared by the end of the week, replaced by crisp, bright mornings. Life moved on, as it always does, but in small, subtle ways. The ripples from those 3 days in court continued to move outward. A little girl had spoken, an officer had listened, and a room full of people had witnessed something that would not easily fade. Sometimes change begins not with sweeping reforms or grand speeches, but with a single moment when one voice is brave enough to speak and another is open enough to hear. And in that old courthouse on those 3 rain-shadowed days, that moment had happened.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.